Okay, I'm finally ready to share my review of the Nikon Z9. This will be the first review of a Nikon mirrorless camera system that I've done since Nikon launched their original mirrorless lineup way back in, I think, 2018. That was the release that actually inspired me to switch to Canon. So I don't think I went into much detail or depth with that initial review other than to say it was not a good fit for me. The autofocus was very much lacking. I don't even remember all the negatives. And I've been kind of loosely keeping my eye on Nikon's progress, but very happy in the Canon camp. I kind of always keep my eye loosely on every system that is out there, including Sony and everything else. There's only so much time in the day for me to test all of these systems. And what caught my attention about the Z9 was actually demoing the sample model they had on display at WPPI this year. It's really hard to get a feel for something in the context of a crowded, loud convention hall, but I could tell immediately after I kind of configured the autofocus system to work the way that I really wanted and was used to. It didn't take long because it's actually very similar to how their DSLRs were set up. And I shot Nikon DSLRs for 10 years. Once I got that set up and I was just doing a few tests, I realized the autofocus on this seems way, way, way more improved than certainly the original Nikon mirrorless cameras that I tested, but actually maybe even better than my Canon R3. So because I did switch completely over to Canon, I sold off almost all of my Nikon lenses, including one of my all-time favorites, the legendary Nikon 58 1.4. So I did buy that one anticipating the fact that I would want to return to the 58mm, not only because of the look, but the size and weight. It's what I call a featherweight lens. It's just very extremely light. You could shoot all day with this. But what I was really surprised to find was that with the 50 1.2, yes, a massive and super heavy lens. It's actually, though, well balanced with the camera body due to the body being quite heavy itself and the grip. Though the overall weight of this setup is heavier, especially way heavier than my Canon R3, it's extremely well balanced. And this is something I've talked about a lot more related to flash and using a bounce flash, and how if you really pay attention to where the center of gravity is on the equipment you're shooting with, you really want to optimize so that things aren't too front heavy most of the time that you're shooting or too back heavy most of the time you're shooting. There's always going to be certain configurations of gear where that will probably be the case, but for the vast majority of time that you spend shooting, especially if you're a wedding photographer, your workhorse kind of bread and butter setup should be really well balanced. The 51.2 is with this, and I actually really enjoy it a lot more than shooting with the 58 1.4. It's too now rear balanced. So I'm getting a lot more strain on the more sensitive parts on my wrists, kind of trying to keep it front balanced. Which is kind of weird. And the weight savings overall isn't that big. I mean, this is a pretty heavy lens, but most of the weight and the bulk in this camera comes from the actual body for sure. So that's one thing I was very surprised about. I kind of shot with the 58 for maybe 15 minutes and never really felt the need to use it again. But depending on how you shoot and how you like to strap your cameras to you and all that, that may not matter to you at all. I have no idea. Matters a huge amount to me. And just sidestepping back, with flash, when you add a flash to the top for bounce flash, if that's what you do, which I highly recommend because that's what I do, it adds a lot of top heaviness to things. So I actually counterintuitively add more weight to the bottom and switch to a grip if I'm using a camera that doesn't have a grip. So I've got the flash and the grip now creating a nice balanced experience. I don't particularly think video is the best way to get into the nitty-gritty details. So I do have a long-form article to go along with it, but I do want to dive into just some of the photos here in Lightroom and talk about a few points. I don't want to make a comparison video, kind of doing a head-to-head autofocus test between this or the R3, because the number of people that might watch this and the specific rig and setup that they have relative to me, like a comparison, if you don't have the R3 and the specific lenses I use for it, the comparison's kind of silly. You're just gonna kind of have to take my word that the autofocus on this is extremely good. And if you're curious about my specific settings and how I like to have 3D tracking turned on and all that stuff, I've got really long, in-depth bookmarked videos on my Patreon that I'll link to in the description of this video for sure. Aside from the overall obvious aspects about the body, it's got a good grip, the weight, it's heavy, but it's well balanced. The screen on the back does give you pretty much every perspective you're probably gonna want, but it's pretty clunky. Yeah, you can shoot vertical like that. You can shoot up and down. Problem is, it's on this rotating multi-hinge thing, which a few other camera makers have tried, Nikon's tried a few iterations of, and it does feel rock solid, but it's too solid. It's not very swift and intuitive to flip things out. I'm constantly kind of pulling it out and it starts in the direction I want, and then I'm not like super strong enough in that direction and it goes the other way. It's hard to describe other than to say I don't like this screen setup. I really, really prefer the setup on my Canon R3 for sure. I'm extremely happy with every button and knob and configuration setting that I could ever want. Even kind of having to relearn the muscle memory of switching from Canon to Nikon, it was a total breeze. And I've always preferred Nikon's implementation of auto ISO, being able to be something you toggle on and off entirely via one button press, which is pretty cool, instead of having to hold a button down. There are ways to set it up in Canon and other cameras to toggle it, but Nikon has a much easier natural implementation, which I really missed. Only other big downside about the overall build, though it is rock solid, is I've really gotten used to having CF Express and an SD card. I really love that in the R3. I hope SD cards don't leave us too soon. The convenience of being able to pop it right into the side of your laptop if you have a newer MacBook is just undeniably so nice. But I can't do that with this. All you've got are two CF Express. Maybe that has something to do with the way they've got video implemented on this. This isn't gonna cover video at all because I haven't even taken video using this camera, but who knows? They decided to commit to just full CF cards, unfortunately. Jumping into some of my favorite images that I've made with this camera. And I've shot everything from helicopter tour in Hawaii to couples, maternity, wedding couples in Hawaii to friends in Prague, a couple in Prague, to a Pakistani fusion wedding just last week here in the Virginia area. So I've got a huge, huge array of skin tones, lighting conditions, and everything else you could imagine to kind of judge from. And I will confidently say that the colors on this sensor, if they're not exactly the same, they very much remind me of my absolute favorite colors ever in a camera sensor, which were from the Nikon D5 DSLR. So I immediately find that processing for skin tones, any skin tone, just came really naturally and easily. It just had this X factor that is undeniable. This is a great example of that. I'll just reset to 0. So this is the raw file, absolutely no edits applied. I'll kind of edit it from scratch just so you can see sort of my process. And you know, whatever you're watching this video on, what you're looking at as, oh, the skin tones, they don't look good to me. If that's the case, it's probably because you're just on a completely different screen than an actual MacBook and it's a recording. But just take my word, the files are really beautiful, and I will have a couple of sample raw files downloadable along with this in the article, so you can open them up on your actual machine and see for yourself with your own editing if you actually like them or not. But it's just one of those things that's hard to define exactly why I like it, other than I get to that skin tone sweet spot way faster with way less fuss than I ever have before. And I can't quite get my Canon files to look the way these Nikon files do. Here's another one, actually with aperture stopped down quite a bit. Let's see, this is with the f2.5. And then I've got some images here. I was borrowing someone's lenses at a workshop. This is a wider lens, a 1.8, that's a 24 Z mount. So it's the native mount, 24 1.8. Again, really beautiful skin tones. Let me just reset to 0 so you can kind of see from scratch. There we go. I kind of exaggerated with a dehaze gradient on the window here. So that's the most exaggerated part of the image in terms of post-processing. But again, overall, the skin tones, no matter, it's not a lens thing, it's definitely a sensor thing. There's gonna be some color shift in lenses for sure. And this is a beautiful lens, but the skin tones overall from the sensor are just undeniably stunning. And that alone is a temptation enough to keep this entire camera rig, for sure. Here's another one. Let's edit this from scratch. It's not fully edited, so I'm just gonna play around. You just get this nice, once exposure's kind of set, you get this nice yellowish, not too desaturated, not too intense skin tone range. There's still some kind of pink in there, And yeah, it just is so easy to, boom, get to where I want to be. Canon, sometimes that's the case. The lighting's really good and I'm using a great lens that I'm really familiar with, but I don't know, sometimes I just struggle to get there with Canon. It's not so bad that I would abandon Canon entirely. It's just, there is an obvious difference. No matter what preset you're using, it really does come down to the color science in the sensor of the cameras you're using at the end of the day. Okay, so jumping over to something a little more interesting than just colors to talk about. So this is the raw file of this image. I'm gonna reset everything to 0. Something I was noticing as a bokeh artifact with this 51.2. And it's the situation where you've got something in the foreground out of focus against a really high contrasted background. So like a really, really bright sky in this case. I'm gonna add a bunch more blues. You start to see along the edges of people's faces this ghosting kind of effect. And the more you, there you go. So there I can really bring it out. You can see this, like, I suppose you call it ghosting. I'm not sure if that's the technical term, but you see this outer haze that I definitely do not see from my Canon 51.2. I have a feeling it's just the way everything is rendered using the lens elements of the Nikon approach. And you get some of it here, and it's very distracting and something I really personally don't like. It's normally not an issue if it's something like this. Like her hand is out of focus, but it's not a really high contrast between the color and whiteness of what he's wearing and her arm. But if we go to something maybe like this, where she's again out of focus and against the bright sky, you start to see that ghosting again on her dupatta and her hair here. I'm gonna reset this to 0. It doesn't, maybe your style of editing won't bring it out so much that it's a problem. I do tend to edit pretty intensely, my overall look, and it seems the more you push and pull the files, the more obvious this becomes. It was actually so obvious in this photo that I went into Photoshop and kind of brushed that ghosting out of his face a little bit. And maybe I brushed a little bit of his nose too much off because it looks shorter. That's kind of an annoying thing, just an added layer that you have to think about in the process of shooting. Is this something I'm gonna wanna fix later? Who knows? But I've seen weird new issues as modern lenses pop up, like they're actually way too sharp. Like people have had to adjust their sharpening action or process of sharpening wherever they do it to account for a lens being too sharp and actually de-sharpen some to get it to look natural. I think that's just a consequence of all modern lenses being designed to shoot 100 plus megapixels sensor sizes in the future. Here's a great example of this lens stopped down to f2.2. It's insanely sharp. I mean, it's razor sharp. And this was a perfect example of a photo, my normal sharpening process. Once I got to the last step, I was like, this is too sharp. I don't even need to do this. Just resize and send it on. Which is fine, except that I like having a little creative control over sharpening. And if the lens is just sharp enough as is, I don't get to really have that as much. I mean, I guess I could get creative in the unsharpening direction of things, but I don't think my brain is quite ready to process that yet. So here are just some more random photos. This is at 3.2. I mean, just insanely sharp. Let's pixel peep something more wide open again. This is the 24 at 1.8. Insanely sharp, but a 1.8 really usually is these days. Let's try this photo. This should be at 1.2. Yes, 1.2, zoomed in, let it render, boom. Just insane sharpness. And the overall autofocus tracking, again, insanely accurate. So there's a difference between sharpness and focus accuracy, and a lot of people get hung up on the fact that the lens might misfocus and think that it's an unsharp lens. They are two totally different things to keep in mind. This lens and body are insanely accurate autofocus with insanely sharp rendering. I mean, it really has kind of a wow factor. Here's another raw file. This is the Nikon 51.2 again at ISO 640. Okay, jumping over to sensor performance in terms of ISO quality. Here's the largest ISO I took a picture of just for fun, a little test photo, 32,000 of my friend Magic, and at the hotel lobby at way up north. That is insanely clean for 32,000 ISO. And that's a fully edited, pushed and pulled file. Okay, you zoom in, maybe it's not so forgiving. But I can dial back my editing intensity a little bit and kind of clean that up. And then just today, Adobe launched a new AI denoise feature. I want to test with this. It'll actually create a whole separate file, a new DNG raw file saved, I think stacked next to this one. You can manually adjust the settings, but I'm just gonna say denoise and see how it does. Oh my gosh. So that's before, that's after. I don't even think I need that much. Let's go full. It's probably gonna be, yeah, way too smooth. You wanna keep some of that rough detail in there. I'm gonna go to like 30. Estimated time, 20 seconds, and then create stack. So it digitally, virtually stacks it on top of the original source raw file in case, I don't know, maybe you realize later that you did too much denoise and you wanna tweak it some, or maybe not enough. You can always go back to your original source file. Okay, so here's the new denoised raw DNG. 32,000 ISO, denoised using an AI model. I don't think you could possibly need Topaz denoise AI ever again. This is fully integrated right into Lightroom. That's absolutely amazing. I am honestly pretty blown away. I think I would never be able to tell this was denoised. You know, you can kind of maybe start to see some things around like the really high contrast areas, like the edges of his eyes, where the skin meets the white of his eyes, but that's only because I know it's been denoised. This is an amazingly cool tool. Maybe I'll make a dedicated Patreon post just about that, but it's pretty straightforward. There's just built-in AI noise reduction now that's way better. I can't wait for them to hopefully add some grain effects in future updates with Lightroom. So bottom line is, on the high ISO register of things, the performance is way better than you'll likely ever need. I wanna find an image that is massively underexposed and see how much I can recover the shadow detail. So this is my friend Chloe, very underexposed source image. I'm pushing it 5 stops, and there's like very little to no noise at all in the darkest part of the image, which is that dark door. So it's gonna let you push and pull these files way more than you could ever really need. I'm curious to see if a shot where I slightly blew out the highlights, let me see how much I can recover here. So yeah, just like most camera sensors, it looks like if you blow the highlights even a little bit, you start to get these weird banding effects here, and you can clearly start to see that you've lost a lot of that highlight data. So I personally always trend toward underexposing and having the highlights be retained and then recovering the shadow detail later. Here's another example of that. I remember this when I was editing it. I exposed too brightly. They're still too dark for the final edit, but all that highlight data from the clouds is totally gone. So, but like I demonstrated a few minutes ago, if you trend toward underexposing in almost any amount, you can recover that no problem, up to 5 stops or more. That is just insane. I mean, looking at the original reset source file, that's how dark I was, and I can totally recover that 4 or 5 stops if I need it. I don't even need that much, and get a nicely editable file, no questions asked. Here's a great example of kind of riding that balance between underexposing, so I can bring back the couple to be as bright as I want, and then I typically use the gradient tool to darken the sky or whatever bright elements I want to recover. All that data is there. You just get to work it back in however you want. I don't want to get too much into the editing side with this review. I just want to simply state that the sensor and the colors, the performance overall is absolutely insane. Autofocus is insane. Battery life is perfectly standard and in keeping with the battery performance of my Canon R3. I probably have 4 Nikon batteries for this to cover an entire 8 to 10 hour wedding day. But yeah, that's it. I've been very impressed. Go read the long form article that's linked in the description of this video, and you can get access to a lot more in-depth detail along with a lot of the sample raw files to play around with editing yourself. Can't wait to make a review of the Z8, which is essentially a mini version size of this. And if the weight is something that has been a problem or keeping you away from trying the Z9, I think the Z8 is gonna solve that for you. I'm curious to see how the Z8 balances with the 51.2 though. That'll be very interesting. As always, thank you so much for your attention, and I will be back soon. Bye everyone.